Hi everyone, this is the full interview with Robbie Arnott. He did give me permission to post the entire thing, and I know some of you wanted to see it, so here it is. So just two things. The first is that there is a segment cut out from this interview because I talked to Robbie about a project that I'm working on, and I didn't want that information to go public, so that's if there's a chunk in there that sounds like I just cut from one place to another, that's the reason. That's the only cut in the interview. Otherwise, heavy spoilers. So if you are planning on reading the book, please go and get the book and read it and finish it before coming back to this video. Otherwise, hope you enjoy. Thanks very much for watching, and thanks to Robbie Arnott for letting me interview him. Hope you enjoy. Recording is live now. Okay, well, not live, but you know what I mean. So, hi, Robbie Arnott. That is how I pronounce your name, is Arnott?
Yep, that's it.
Yep.
Hi, Nicholas. How are you?
No worries. Robbie Arnott is the author of Flames. It's a novel set in Tasmania. And you're Tasmanian yourself, yeah, Robbie?
Yes, I am. I'm a sixth generation Tasmanian, I think.
Oh, wow. So like I felt like the reason why I came across your book actually is because my mum sent it to me saying that she has not read a more evocative representation of Tasmania in literature that she's been exposed to, and I think that it's fair to say that place is probably a really important aspect of your novel. So something that is always part of an interesting part of storytelling is setting, and place I think is a really important part of that. So could you talk a little bit about your experience with Tasmania and how that I know that's probably a little bit of an open question, but the parts that really made you want to like represent Tasmania in literary form?
Yeah, sure. And thanks. I grew up in northern Tasmania, and I now live in southern Tasmania. And so I've lived and travelled around pretty much all over the entire island. And I'm quite a keen bushwalker and fisherman, and I like being out in the environment. And these things all indirectly have affected me and shaped a lot of the way I think about the world and think about Tasmania. So when it came to writing a novel, I didn't actually set out to try and write about Tasmania in a specific way. I didn't have any really lofty goals about it. It just came out in my writing quite quickly as soon as I started describing the natural landscapes. Um, so as that went on throughout the book, I started writing about different places, and I found that these are the most pleasurable to write because there's something that is really, really inspiring about all the different landscapes on just one small island stuck in the Southern Ocean. And I found that I wanted to represent Tasmania in a way that felt real, but also felt like it hadn't been done before, which was a bit of a challenge. But I wanted people to both recognize Tasmania in it, but also be surprised at their own recognition by doing it in a different way. And I guess the main way I tried to do that was try to be as lyrical and descriptive as possible, even in the minutiae of the landscape that I was describing.
Hmm. I think something that you did extremely well was you captured the magic of Tasmania. For like, I've lived on the mainland in Tasmania, in various stages of my life, and I always describe to mainlanders that Tasmania is a very magical place to be, and that's literalized in your book in various ways. So, like, at what point did you decide to introduce like magical hyper real elements to the setting that you were writing in?
Yeah, it wasn't a really conscious decision because I wrote the first chapter by itself, not knowing that I would end up turning it into a novel. So in the first chapter, there's very magical realist elements in there, and I found that quite pleasurable to write, and I enjoy reading things like that. So I wrote that as an exercise because I was becoming very frustrated with trying to write realist contemporary Australian fiction that I thought would get published. So I wrote this first three or four pages purely as an exercise to write about Tasmania in a different way and extend my imagination a bit. And then when I decided to turn that story into a novel by writing in different genres and different voices and stitch the whole thing together, it made sense to me to continue bringing in magical elements because that was what made it feel different to me as a piece of fiction compared to other works. It made it feel kind of original in a way, even though I've had lots of inspirations behind it. And I like reading things like that where it's hard to tell what an author has completely made up and what is something that actually exists in that real place. So that was what I wanted to achieve, and that's why I did it. I wanted anyone who might end up reading it to not be quite sure what was real and what wasn't, and for that to be part of the reading experience, because that's what I enjoy doing. And it's also just a lot of fun to make things up. and that's what I enjoyed a lot doing it. So in the second chapter, there's a fisherman who's in partnership with a seal, and they hunt tuna. And it's much in the same way that a farmer will be in partnership with a sheepdog. And I was inspired directly by that. I spent some time on farms, and I have friends who have very close relationships with working dogs. And so all I did was look at that and then extend my imagination and try to put a bit of magic into it and make it feel both completely removed from reality, but also almost believable. And that was the balance I was trying to go for.
Yeah, when I was reading that chapter, I had a moment, because for the most part, I was thinking to myself, okay, like, this doesn't happen, seals aren't in partnership with fishermen. But I had a moment near the end where I was like, wait, but does it? And I felt compelled to like look it up just in case, just before I go, making a statement like, oh, this is a magical element of the novel. I was like, maybe I should make sure. So I think you did strike that balance. You said that you had some inspirations for this. What were some of those inspirations? Did you pull from the magical realism genre when writing this?
I did a bit. I tried not to write too directly like other writers. Someone like Gabriel Garcia Marquez is a huge influence on this, particularly 100 Years of Solitude, because he's such a phenomenal proponent of magical realism. But at the same time, he and other Latin American writers, obviously, I wouldn't go as far as say they invented magical realism, because I don't feel like I'm enough of authority on the topic. But they use magical realism as a tool of undoing colonialism. And it's a very important part of the genre that is in many ways why it exists in its current form. And I'm a white person from Tasmania, and I'm not doing anything like that, and I wouldn't claim to be doing anything like that. So I wouldn't say that my work has the same intentions as that, but it definitely has been inspired by those elements in writers like Marquez. A really, really close inspiration for this book is Gould's Book of Fish by Richard Flanagan, which does use almost magical realism, but definitely completely imaginative alternative history of Tasmania. And he wrote about Tasmania in a way that was very different to all the other books I'd read about Tasmania. And it almost felt like that book gave me a bit of license to just make things up about a known place. And that completely opened my mind up to what I could do. And in purely other senses, David Mitchell's work was been quite a big influence, I think, in the way he structures his chapters and the way he blends in things that are unreal with things that are real. And again, with the structure, A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan was a really large inspiration on how to try and connect a book together by using a range of different narrators. And I won't go too on about all sorts of influences, but Angela Carter has particularly her collection of stories and her story, The Bloody Chamber, which reimagines old fairy tales and fables, is another way that it really inspired me into writing differently and thinking that it could be done and not having to stick to a conventional way of writing a novel.
So do you use inspirations consciously? Like, when writing, you think, I think something from, Richard Flanagan or Gabriel Garcia Marquez's style would work here, and consciously include it? Or is it more of like you write what you think is best, and then looking back upon it, you go, oh, that seems a little bit like one of these other authors that I'm inspired by? Is it a conscious or unconscious thing? Yeah.
Unconscious. Definitely the latter you described there. It's never sitting down and trying to stitch together different writers' styles or ideas. It's just reading. I find that I read a lot and just almost inhale all these different techniques and styles and things that I like and things that surprise me. So, and then when I'm writing and then I come back and look at it later, I often pick up on even things, just flow of sentences or or use of words, I look back and go, well, that's a bit reminiscent of this book I've been reading lately. And sometimes I think, look, it's influenced my writing and made me better. And sometimes I think I've got to delete all this. I'm just aping a better writer than me. It's not a good look. So like I never read Nabokov when I'm trying to write something because it just makes me depressed. And I never read David Foster Wallace, particularly his nonfiction, because he's got a level of complexity and humor that I end up writing these long, complicated sentences that have some form of intellectual punchline at the end, and I just can't do it. So I put him down as well. So it's definitely looking back at the influences and finding out afterwards just which writer has changed the way I'm writing.
I want to ask back on some of the magical elements and were there times during the drafting process where you like had something included that you were like, oh, there was a magical element that maybe you removed, or decided that a realist passage that was more realistic needed a more magical element? Like, how do you make the decision to include those types of like elements that you know are probably going to be noticed?
I don't think I deleted any major magical elements, but I did do a lot of reordering and refining to try and get the balance right. And there's no easy answer for how to find that balance between how you want your work to feel. It's really just kind of fumbling in the dark, I found. So sometimes I'd write a section where there's just way too much exposition. And for months, I'd think that it was just necessary to the story because otherwise it wouldn't make any sense, even though I felt it was clunky exposition. And then I come back to it and go, look, I'm just going to delete it all and we don't need it. And it was never necessary in the first place, but I couldn't see it. Couldn't see the forest for the trees, if to use that phrase. So when combining the magical and realist elements, it was almost just stepping back from the page for a while and coming back and thinking, well, is any of this getting too much? At any point, is it getting too unbelievable on the magical realism side, or is it just getting too boring on the realist side? And almost just throwing all the balls in the air and trying to get the balance right. And there was nothing I could measure against to know how I'd gotten it right. I couldn't, dip my finger in and taste it and go, oh yeah, I've got that right. It's just a lot of crossing fingers and trusting myself, and then having a very good editor to help me get it right.
So one of the first things that I noticed when reading your book is the perspective and voice changes with each chapter. And I thought that it made the story almost feel like one big story that was compiled from all of these smaller stories told by different people. And I was wondering, at what point did you decide that your story would have these multiple voices? Did this, you think, make it a little bit more difficult to write? And what was your intention sort of surrounding that? I know it's bad to ask for authorial intent, but I feel I have to.
No, that's all right. It's probably easiest to answer that in how I came to write the novel. So I did write that first chapter, and it went better than I thought it would. And I ended up having that published in an anthology, and people seemed to like it. I got feedback from people and who weren't, my girlfriend or my mum. So I thought that was great. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to try and turn this into a novel. So I set about trying to write a novel all completely in the same style as those first 4 pages in the first chapter. And within 20 pages, I just run out of steam and couldn't keep the story going, couldn't keep it progressing, felt that it was getting laboured and uninteresting and just was turning in on itself. So I just decided to write a second chapter because I had this idea about a fisherman and a seal, and to link that back into the first one and then see how that goes. So I did that for 2 chapters, and then I did it for 3 or 4. By the time I'd done 6 and was vaguely plotting out the end of the book, it was kind of coming together. And I'd never sat down and planned the whole thing out or had this big master scheme about drawing it all together. As I was writing it, I was working about 2 chapters in front. And all I wanted to do with each chapter was to make it surprising and interesting. And I really wanted it to feel that you might be opening it and reading, well, hang on, what's this story? This is something completely different. And then to realize how it connects with the whole main narrative. I wanted it to be constantly surprising and interesting. And I ran a few risks of making it, distasteful or annoying for some reason. Or some people might hate gothic horror, and then now they've got a story about a wombat farmer who is dreaming of murderous cormorants. So I had to run that risk. But I never thought the book would get published anyway. So I just did it to entertain myself. And when I would think about it really hard and come up with an idea where I thought, well, no one would be expecting this. If I was reading this, I wouldn't expect the next chapter to be about this. And then I'd plot out how the main story linked in and worked up. And if the main story did not work with it, I would throw that idea out and come up with a new one that made sense with the main narrative, and then just write it and keep going. And didn't give myself enough time to stop and think about it, because if I'd really stopped and thought about it, I probably never would have finished it.
Yeah. Did you find it challenging to come up with new voices for the narrator? Because I noticed that not only does the perspective change, but also the writing style in some ways. Like there are certain writing motifs that turn up in some chapters that are absent from the other chapters. Some chapters are written in past tense, some are in present tense, some are internally focalized, some are externally focalized. So was that a challenge, writing in all of these different styles and trying to bring them together into like a single narrative?
Yeah, it was. It definitely was a challenge. The way I did it was a couple of ways. I would completely try and forget about all the other chapters I'd written up to that point, and I'd have all my notes prepared that I'd handwritten earlier about the beats that I wanted to happen in this chapter and the flow of it and the plot points I needed to work in. But other than that, I tried to treat it as a separate piece of writing. So some of the things that reoccur in there are actually not that deliberate. A lot of them are just unconscious, because I have the rest of the chapters subconsciously swimming around in my brain. But I wanted to try and keep them as separate as possible so they felt new and different. And part of the way I did that was I'd go to my local bookshops and wander around the different aisles and buy books and read books from completely different genres and try and take in those influences and try and figure out ways other people had written a whole book set in that genre when I was only trying to do it in one chapter. So that's where some of those motifs come from, because I was trying to draw on that rich history of genre writing, particularly in some of the horrors or the detective section or something like that. I wanted it to feel familiar in that aspect. But the tense stuff was difficult too, because it is tricky to have one novel set in multiple tenses, because it can really throw you off when you're trying to figure out, well, has that happened yet, or is it happening right now? And it can make you feel a bit unhinged or unmoored in the reading process. But I think by using different genres, I managed to cover that up a bit and have so many things going on. It didn't feel so disjointed, I hope.
Yeah, so the main motif of the novel is the title. It's flames. The flames turn up several points, well, many points, probably every chapter. So why did you end up settling on flames as part? I know it's the inspiration was, which fires was it? I have.
Oh, it's the Dun Alley bushfires.
Yeah, the Dun Alley bushfires. That one. Sorry, I forgot the name. So that was sort of how I interpreted the flames as the main symbol of the text. But could you go into a little bit more detail, when did you decide that this would be like the main motif of the story? Because I noticed that you say that the first chapter was written sort of in isolation before the rest of the book, and fire turns up there too, because the women of the McAllister family burn up because they're cremated. So did it extend from that? Did you notice that fire was an element of chapter one and then extend that into other parts of the novel?
Yeah, I did. So in chapter one, those flames there were inspired by the Dun Alley bushfires and other bushfires that occurred in Tasmania, particularly in the Highlands, where a lot of really, really old growth forest has been burnt out and it's never going to grow back. And that really stuck with me because it's such a traumatic thing to happen. to have, tens of thousands of years old King Billy pines burning out, and hearing commentators from the mainland say, "Oh, that's okay, everything regenerates after fire," and seeing that, thinking, well, no, it's never coming back. So that was really, quite horrifying, and that fed into writing this idea of cremation and coming back after cremation. But as for the terms of the flames reappearing throughout the book and becoming that linking symbol, it's a bit hard for me to say. I guess I stumbled upon it as something that would tie it all together in the first sense. And then I came up with the idea of Charlotte, sorry, this is a bit of a spoiler, but Charlotte McAllister having the fire leaking out of her when she completely loses emotional control, and that gift having come from her father. And the symbolism of that was, I really wanted to write this character in Charlotte who was very, very in tune with her emotions and completely expressive all the time, but that never made her weak. I really don't like this idea in fiction, and this is idea in society, that someone being emotional is a sign of weakness, and that's the culture I grew up in. And it's always been implied to me throughout many different cultural institutions or through society in general that, women cry and that's weak. And when women are emotional, they're being unreasonable and irrational, and men should be stoic and hard and never show their emotions. And so what I wanted to create was a character who is extremely emotional, but it only lends to her strength. It never weakens her. And by having this destructive power of flames come out of her that she can eventually control, I wanted to use that as symbolism for the power of her not having to hide who she is, if that makes any sense. And on the other hand, I had the character of Levi, her brother, who's constantly trying to be pent up and control himself and not let anyone see the real person he is. And that leads to his degradation. And it's a very, very bad thing for him. And it was just, I guess there was a level of symbolism and commentary there in how I structured those characters.
Something that I noticed actually is that the character of the father, who is made of fire, or is the spirit of the fire, it's left very open, I think. He through the first part of his chapter, before he meets the mother of the McAllisters, he seems like a very, very detached with his emotions, and yet when they more emerge like after he begins a family, falls in love, raises his daughter. And so how does that him be initially seeming, I might be misinterpreting, but how does that sort of like relate to Charlotte's flames being tied to her emotions?
I wanted, you're totally right. He is a very detached person, if we can call him a person, through most of before he meets his wife. And I guess in that he was completely unaware of how to handle his emotions because he's never had them before. But he did adopt a particularly masculine technique or trait of seeking to control it and seeking to hide things from his wife, and from not being able to confront his own weaknesses. So he deals in absolutes. So, when she dies, he cuts off all connection with his children because he can't possibly handle that, dealing with seeing the same thing happen to them. And he tries to constantly manipulate all the information around him, and he manipulates the people around him through subtle and very obvious ways as well. So when he becomes in contact with his emotions, he doesn't know how to handle them and seeks to always assert control. Whereas Charlotte doesn't. She's not always trying to control other people. She's just being who she is, and she's not trying to apologize for anything about herself. And I think that was the main difference between them. There's a level of self-acceptance from Charlotte, and there's a level of attempted control from her father.
Do you think that the changing perspectives in the novel lent to like greater sympathy with some of the characters? So, like, for example, something that I know is that the detective character, when we're reading her chapter told from her perspective, where we as the readers are almost, sympathize with her because we are sharing her perspective. But then when Charlotte is the point of view character in a much later chapter, the first sentence, excuse me, my computer made a noise.
That's right.
The first sentence of the chapter is "I don't trust the detective," and that sort of sets the tone for the reader also looking at the detective with a certain level of mistrust, even though we've sympathized with her in a previous chapter. Do you think that this sort of like difference in perspective like helped get certain things across, or what were you trying to achieve with that?
Yeah, I was trying to give the whole story a much more rounded feel, and by telling it through a chorus of voices, we can see not only how the characters feel about themselves, but also how they feel about each other. So at that stage in the novel, Charlotte has quite a lot of reason to mistrust a lot of people, and someone just turning up out of the blue and saying they know things about you and saying they're going to help you, um, while wearing a long coat and looking like a noir stereotype detective, I think is pretty just not very trustworthy. Um, so what I wanted to do was to show a character and how they view the world, and then show how another character views them, and have both the opinions and both perspectives from each character being completely understandable and believable. I thought that would be enjoyable to read, and I like reading books like that where you see people as they see themselves, and then you see them as other people see them,
Hmm.
and you know that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but it's very hard to get a completely unbiased view.
Did you, while writing this, did you have to kind of like keep track of which characters know what and who thinks what at any point in the story to make sure like the differing perspectives, were consistent with what the characters were feeling as, you know?
Yeah, I had a pretty thick notebook, um, where I was writing down what they thought, what they'd said, what they did, and made sure it all. This is just the nuts and bolts of. This is the first novel I've written, but it's the
Oh
nuts
yeah.
and bolts of writing a novel. I've realised is making sure everything links up, and there's no little stray loose ends that don't make sense, because that would just be infuriating for anyone reading it, even writing it. So yeah, I had to be pretty careful about making sure that everything spoke to each other truly. And this
Hmm.
this isn't the most complex novel in the world. Like, it does use a lot of voices and characters, but the plot itself isn't particularly complex. It was more about getting the characters right, and not somehow representing them in a later chapter where they felt changed for no certain reason. So there was a lot of line level tinkering to get that right, which nearly drove me insane.
Oh yeah. I have a couple of characters I actually want to ask you about. The first is the Esk God. I had a phone call with my mum the other day where she said that she thought the S God was like the most resonant character in the book for her, which I thought was odd because the character itself is only present for one chapter. I think he dies at the end of it, and but his hide or the fleece, because he's a water rat, is continues to exist in the story as a significant element. Thurston Hugh has it, and then Levi obtains it from him. Um, something. What was did you intend for this character to have sort of like a presence in the narrative even after his perspective is gone and even he is gone?
Yeah, I wanted him to be resonant throughout the rest of the book as soon as he's gone, because he's not there for very long, as you mentioned. And I did that through the strange power of his pelt that Thurston first has and then Levi acquires, which kind of imbues them with this haughty confidence. Well, Thurston's already very haughty, but this kind of deluded arrogance and self assurance that the S god has, because he is a water rat who's fully in the belief that he is the god of the river. And what I wanted to do with that chapter is to not really make it clear whether or not he actually was the god of the river. Um, but I wanted him to really think that he was, and to take his journey throughout the South Esk River, and to have that reveling in nature, and to be completely at one with all the world around him, and to be completely furious with the depredations happening to the waterway and the landscape that he lived in, and almost to represent this aspect of nature that's mourning the loss of some of itself and the damage being done to it by humans, but also to have a distinctive personality of a really kind of arrogant and pissed off personality. Because I think the natural world would have a right to be. You often see the natural world, when it's anthropomorphized like Gaia in the Captain Planet TV series, and she's wearing a flowing robe and she's all calm and peaceful all the time. I kind of wanted to have something the opposite of that, where just kind of pissed off because all this bad stuff's happening to it. And that's what I wanted to create with this little character, and I wanted his spirit to just kind of pulse every now and then throughout the rest of the book, to appear and to make you remember, well, hang on, yeah, a lot of bad stuff is happening to the island in this book, or the natural world in general, and to have his outrage and his arrogance just kind of reasserting itself every now and then. I'm really glad your mum liked that chapter, by the way. I thought when I reviewed the manuscript, when I completely finished it before I sent it to publishers, I went through it and I thought, this is the chapter where I'll lose people. People will get to the fact that there's a water rat talking to them, and they'll think, well, this was fun, but now this book's gone berserk, so, and they throw it away. But yeah, I'm really glad people like it.
Well, the thing that I picked up from the chapter is that there were like the land didn't just have magic in it; it had like magical entities, like spirits.
Yeah.
And so like and then of course the father is one of those in the later chapters, is the being in the fire. But I was going to ask, was there like what was the impetus for like putting like entities like spirits in the story, like that? So
yeah, yeah. No, I can speak to that. I think I wanted to create a hint of a much vaster spiritual or magical world that I never really delved into, but I wanted there to be this hint of it going on all the time. I didn't want to write a book where there was this really fleshed out mythology and magic system that all made sense and was all neatly tied together. But I just wanted to just be looming on the horizon of the story. So when there is that character of the S-God, and he kind of blithely mentions a few other spirit-like creatures like the hunt god and the sky god, and of course he's in love with the cloud god, I wanted to all just be like tiptoeing along the edges of a much greater magical landscape that the book was taking place in. And one of the reasons I want to do that, because it's fun and it's fun to write, and I like to read things where there's always a hint of something much larger going on, and this is just one story taking place. And also because I wanted it just to be a little structure around, so it hinted that a lot of the human characters in their lives aren't really that important in the great deal of things. I wanted them to be seen as bit players in this much larger scheme or larger narrative going on that we're only seeing a very small part of. I think, does that answer your question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it does. Was there were there Aboriginal elements in that, or is it more of a personal thing for you?
It's purely imaginative on my part. I didn't draw on any Indigenous or Palawa texts to try and establish their version or their idea of the beginning of the world. I'm not Indigenous, and that's just not my place as a person or as a writer to try and tell Indigenous stories. I did include some elements of Indigenous history in there, and there are a couple of Indigenous characters who make very brief appearances, because when writing about Tasmanian history, there's no shying away from that, of the horrors of colonialism, the terrible things that were done to them.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to include any of their spiritual beliefs in there, because that's not my story to tell.
Yeah. Did you kind of like hold back on fleshing out the spiritual side a little bit more because of that reason? Because you didn't want to like feel like you were speaking on behalf of the Aboriginal people in describing the spirituality of the land?
No, I don't think so. I don't think I held back because of that, but I just made sure I didn't try and use any of their stories or try and speak on their behalf. Yeah, I held back on doing it purely for the sake of just the narrative and not wanting to overflow the pages with mysticism or spirituality. But yeah, I did. Yeah, not for that reason.
Oh, yeah. I was thinking about your book yesterday and suddenly realized that Thurston Hugh, however you pronounce his last name.
I pronounce it Hoff, but it doesn't really matter, really.
No, not really. He's not the most important character in the novel, but he is, I would consider him like a member of the main cast of characters who appear in the novel. But I think he's one of the only ones where we never actually get his perspective. Like, because each chapter is told from a different perspective, and the chapter that features, I think there are two chapters that feature him. The first one is the correspondence of letters, and the second one is a book written by someone else who describes him living in a town and being a rather unpleasant character. Yeah. I'm wondering, is there a reason why we don't get his perspective?
Yeah, there is. It's just that I felt that he was represented through his voice and actions in a strong enough way. And I just got the feeling that a character like him would become really insufferable when having to live inside his head for a whole chapter. So deluded. And I think someone like him can be very entertaining when hearing his opinions, such as when it's in the correspondence, or when hearing him described and some of the antics to get up to around town. But I didn't want him to overflow and then to become this bitter, jaded, cynical, pretty much deluded guy, because I thought I'd represented that well enough. I thought I got enough of a sense of him through what I had written about him, and giving him a voice to narrate a chapter I thought would just be more of the same, but it wouldn't have the light and shade of the two letters. So having Levi's letters bouncing off, I thought I would end up just having to throw my computer through the window because I'd be so angry and spend any time with this fictional character. He's kind of very lightly inspired by Ignatius in oh God, what's the book? I'll come back to it. But,
I can look it up now. How do you spell Ignatius?
Hang on, I'll look it up in 1 second. I really like this book. I haven't read it in years. It's a famous farcical book by an American writer, a Confederacy of
Okay.
There's a confederacy of dunces called Ignatius Riley, who's very intelligent and is just outraged and haughty and horrible to everyone because he thinks he's a genius. It's very, very so he's slightly inspired by that.
Nicola, when her chapter is where her and Charlotte begin becoming romantically involved with each other, and I would say that's a pleasant surprise. I am a queer person. I do like seeing queer people in fiction, and so I was like, but I still have to ask, what made you include this relationship as it was in the novel?
Yeah, I didn't originally intend for them to become lovers or to form a relationship. I thought that they were just going to be quite close friends, and then as I was writing that chapter, it kind of became clear to me that the book had already been filled with so much loss and so much sorrow, and nothing really good had happened to anybody. And it just so happened at the same time that I started realizing that the relationship I was writing here, however subconsciously or however much I might have just realized it myself, that it was tending towards a romantic relationship. And I thought about, should I do that? Should I not do it? And I ignored it and kept writing. And it became clear to me that no, this is much more powerful if they develop a relationship. It deepens their emotional connection. It deepens their relationship with each other, and it brings an emotional heft to the story that wasn't existing there yet. So once I decided that, and once I thought, well, I think this is what I need to do, I had to ask myself, should I do it? Because I'm not a lesbian, and I'm not a bisexual person either. I'm a straight, able-bodied, cis white guy. So I really had to ask myself, well, should I do this? Can I do this in a way that's respectful? Can I do this in a way that is not exploitative at all? So when I thought about it, and I had a few good conversations with a bunch of my non-straight friends about whether I should be doing it, whether I should not be doing it, and mostly I just something I did, which I think all writers or good writers do, and I interrogated my intentions. So I asked myself, what am I trying to achieve here? Am I putting a lesbian relationship in for any sort of box-ticking reason? Am I doing it for any salacious reason? And am I doing it for any other reason that's sort of exploitative? And I realized that well, no, I'm not doing it because I'm doing it because I think that these characters are falling in love with each other. And I didn't think I could write about a lesbian relationship or a bisexual relationship in any strong, fleshed out detail. But I did think I could write about love and attraction. So that was what I ended up doing. I didn't try and include anything about their sexuality that explained it, or didn't have any flashbacks to when they realized they were not straight, or any sort of formative sexual experiences for them. I just wrote about their love and attraction because I thought I could do that honestly, and I could do that in a way that represented those characters truly and non-exploitatively, basically. um, and I got to a point where I thought, if I don't put this in here, then I'm avoiding something. And basically what I wanted to, the way I wanted to write it was, I thought, I'll just write these two characters falling in love with each other exactly the way anyone would write, or I would write straight characters falling in love with each other. I won't make any reference to their sexuality at all, other than the fact that they're attracted to each other and they want to be with each other, and they have much deepened commitment. They deepen their commitments to each other. So that was the way I ended up doing it, and I really hope I've done it well, and I have done it in a way that's respectable, and I haven't monumentally stuffed up.
No, I wouldn't say that. I think for, like, you didn't. I think the key part for me was that you didn't like eroticize the characters, because usually when you see, like, especially like queer women in media that's made for straight people, there's some eroticization of queer women, and that's something that happens mainly to with queer men. It's more like, that everyone cracks jokes because it's funny, and I mean, it is, but there's that. But I noticed there weren't any of like the typical, like, just media not really caring, just doing whatever's the kind of thing. And so I thought it was very respectful. My only like piece of feedback is that I didn't think there was much awareness as to orientation. So usually what happens with queer people, as far as I know, and I can't speak on behalf of every queer person, but generally I believe this to be true based on my experience and people who I know, is that most people are very aware, like, I am straight, I am gay, I am bisexual. And so even if it's not like openly discussed, it's more like, the orientation is sort of forms the basis for the attraction. So it's like most people don't like fall in love with somebody they're not oriented to be attracted to. And so so the only thing really that I felt could possibly be improved is that I didn't get the impression that either of them were queer before that chapter. And so I felt, but like you said, you didn't really want to go into detail or explain it. And also we weren't given either of their perspectives in their own voice before that chapter. So it does make sense, but I wouldn't know like exactly the way you'd want to incorporate that if you did want to incorporate it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
No, thanks for the feedback. That's really good to hear. Because you always want to be doing it as well as you can. No, thank you. I hadn't thought about that. I tried to go the other way, and it sounds like I might have gone the other way of completely missing it. But no, thank you.
No,
yeah,
but
no, fair enough.
No worries. If talk about, I want to talk about Levi for a little bit, because something that I noticed about him is that I think he's the only character where we get whose voice is in two different chapters. I think every chapter is a different voice, but Levi gets not only the first chapter but the last one. He gets the denouement, almost like after the big climax and everyone's settling back into, trying to settle back into a normal life. So like, was that what was the intention behind giving that role to Levi?
Well, the first chapter in particular, I wanted to give that to Levi because I wanted to be a bit of a trick. I wanted it to feel like, well, this is going to be Levi McAllister's story, when I actually think it's much more Charlotte's. I think she's much more the central character in the book, and because he's the one following her around. And then when it came to the very end, I wanted to give him a little bit of closure, and I thought it'd be a nice book ending of the book, as it was, to have him having two short chapters just at the start and end in his voice, and showing the ways in which he's changed, because he does go on a bit of a rocky internal ride. partly due to his own self-flagellation and the way he won't face up to the things that are troubling him, and his obsession with trying to control everything. And also when he acquires the pelt and then gets even more uh, discombobulated. And I wanted to have this nice settling period at the end where we've got this character at the very end who is speaking in his trademark, quite flat voice and trying to be very calm all the time, but he's got nothing left. Whereas in the first chapter, he's completely brimming with his quiet passion and plans and desire to shape everything around him the way he wants it to. And in the final chapter, he's using that same voice, but he's almost completely out of breath, as it were, and he's got nothing left in him. He has no plans. He has no idea what's going on. All he wants is for his sister to forgive him, and he still doesn't really understand her, but he's just willing to accept her for who he is and let her live her life. And to give him just that difference in the way he speaks, even though his voice is very similar, but what's inside him is completely different. And I thought that would be just a nice way to start and end the book, really.
Something that I think is quite astounding about your book is that I think I'm the kind of person who's like very trope sensitive, and I kind of like when I start seeing like, you know, tropes and patterns emerge, I'm just like, oh, here we go, here's this part of the story and so on. But with your book, I think it constantly kept me guessing, like, because of the switches in perspectives and styles and, you know, the direction that the story was going in. Even like you said, the misdirection with making the reader think that Levi was the protagonist, and then Charlotte ends up being more of the central protagonist. Like, even up towards the end, I think I was like, okay, it's all going to end in tragedy. And, you know, I thought everyone's going to die. But then everyone survives, and you get not necessarily like everyone lives happily ever after, but you get kind of like a sense of relief at the end of the book. Like, oh, we're all still here. We all can, you know, live a stable life, you know, aside from the S-God, and Thornton. Everything turned at Thurston, and the guy with the wombat farmer who goes crazy. Yeah, I like, even that I was expecting him to turn back up again, because the chapter ends with him saying like the cormorants are telling me that there's more to do. I thought he was going to turn up again, but he did, and so like
it does.
He kind of does.
There's one line in the second last chapter where the cloud god starts raining. There's just a tiny line where something like him is seen emerging out of a mine. Yeah, so it's really small. It's just the smallest reference to him still being around.
Wow, I finished the book and it's still keeping me guessing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like, how do you do that? How do you play with expectations like that?
Yeah, I wish I had a really like smart intellectual answer. Yeah, the main one was to not know what I was doing in the first place. If I had all the chapters planned out neatly, I reckon I would have written in a way where there would be more hints and it would have been more obvious what's going to happen next. But because I approached it by just making it up as I went along and having the genres and individual layered stories kind of invented as I went along, I just didn't know what was going to happen next. And when I figured it all out and got it all together, many of the times it kind of surprised me a lot, because I went, well, I want to write a chapter like this. Does this fit? Let's find out. And that's, but I had this, when I finished it, I was like, I came towards the end of it and I realized like, oh, yeah, no, things have turned out reasonably well for everybody. And I hadn't, about halfway through, I would have thought, oh, it's a bit mean of me to put Levi through all this stuff and then I'm just going to kill him anyway. And because that's what because I hadn't plotted his death, but I just kind of had this inkling notion in the back of my head, like, this guy's going to have to die. You shouldn't control women like this. He's going to die. But the way I ended up writing it was him having that a little bit of closure by meeting the seal at the end. So yeah, I surprised myself basically by like constantly not knowing what I was doing.
Oh yeah. Would you describe your writing process as very experimental?
it's some, well, I still use computer and pad and pen, so that's pretty conventional. But the actual, yeah, the process of it, I don't know how other people write books. Um, I was talking to last year. I was talking to Ryan O'Neill, who was a fantastic short story writer and now novelist, and he won the Prime Minister's Award for fiction last year. And he was saying he won't even sit down to write a story until he knows exactly how it ends and how it's all plotted out. And we were talking to another writer who said, "Oh no, I just sit there. I just sit at the desk and see what happens. I have no idea." And so it made me realize that no one knows what they're doing really in terms of how they plot it out. I guess my writing is experimental in some ways in that I'm not interested in writing realist novels, which is almost all of what gets published in Australia at the moment is realism. And I like reading a lot of realist novels, ones that are done really well. I'm perfectly happy reading those, but I don't think I'm good at writing them, and I think it's just a really kind of boring thing to keep writing. So my only experimentation really is to try and think, well, has anyone done this before? Has anyone done this well before? Would I like reading something like this? And then I just dive into it. And I stop worrying about whether or not my publisher will want anything to do with it. And when I wrote Flames, I had no publisher. I was just staying up all night trying to write a book because I'm an idiot. But yeah.
Oh, you're not an idiot.
No, I felt like it at the time.
Well, like, how was the like experience like drafting and revising this novel? Because if a lot of it was spent in terms of like generating the ideas was sort of like was sort of like I'm trying the phrase "done on the fly" entered my head, but that's not appropriate at all. So well, basically, like how you described how you write it as the story develops in your head, and sometimes it even seems like you don't know what you're doing. Once you have like a completed narrative sitting in front of you on paper, on the computer screen, wherever, what's like the next thing you think that you do to like further develop and refine the story after you've got like that first draft? Just for my my audience out there who are looking to write themselves.
Yeah, oh sure. But actually, the actual process of it, I leave it alone for a couple of days, and then I come back to it. And to be really pragmatic, I go onto a website called asoftmurmur.com, and which just plays white noise, and I play the sound of thunder every out. And then in Microsoft Word, I click that little button that is focus view, so it takes over your whole screen, so I can't look at anything else. And then I just very slowly and methodically go through the text and read it out loud because I don't have a printer at home. And I do that to try and get rhythm and pacing and cadence right. And then I start deleting and inserting commas. And then I start pairing long sentences with short sentences. And I start trying to put stressed monosyllables at the end of most sentences. That's a tip I picked up from Michelle de Kretzer. Actually, she says always put stressed monosyllables at the end of sentences. I started doing it and I realized no wonder she always wins the most, frankly. That's a really smart. So I do that and then I read it out loud and my cat comes and meows at me for making too much noise. and then I do leave it alone and then I come back to it a day or two later and I do what I call cliche hunting, and I go around finding anything that's even like a conventional cliche and I delete it. And then I find things that I think are just tired language, just an expected way of saying something. And I either change it or delete it and pare it back. I just don't think I have any use of heavily used language that is not working in a way that's pleasurable to read or different or interesting. I just get rid of it. And unless I try and write in a more original way. And I just go through that process over and over again. And then the only thing it interrupts is if I realize I don't like the plot or the characters doing something stupid or something on a larger level like that. And then I change that. Then I do the whole thing over and over. Then I start all over again. But that's essentially my drafting process.
Oh, yeah. I think I've asked pretty much almost all I wanted. Is there any comments or advice that you want to give to some of the aspiring writers out there who are looking to publish their first novel?
Oh, be weird. Be weird, different, and write what you enjoy reading. Don't try and write for an audience, but try and just write what if you picked it up in a bookstore and you'd been hit over the head and you didn't know that you'd written it, that you imagine you would be drawn towards. I think too many people try and write things that they think are what good writing is, rather than what they know to be good writing or what they enjoy. And apart from that, stress monosyllables at the end of sentences and kill all cliches. They're my basic tips, really.
But then won't stress monosyllables at the end of sentence become cliches?
Oh, no!
Oh, no!
Oh, probably. Yeah. And rhythm is the other thing. Read everything out loud and try and have everything in a rhythm that is pleasing to you, and is actually, because there is a music to writing that a lot of people don't realize when you read it out loud, or your brain, the pacing of the structure of a sentence compared to the sentence that follows it. Try and listen for the music in it, is what I was always told.
All right. Thank you very much.
That's all right. Thanks, Nicholas. Thanks for taking interest in the book.
No worries. I thought I'll just hit the stop recording button.